Construction on the original dam started soon after 1837. It was 14 feet high, had 2 gates and flumes, one on each side of the north and south side. The south gate was used to regulate water going over the dam. Industries were, in no certain order, woolen mill, grist mill, planing mill, sawmill, cider mill, blacksmith, distillery, and hydroelectric plant. The grist mill remained in operations until the 1930s when it was sold to the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, NIPSCO, that used it for the hydroelectric plant until the 1940s. At that time it was sold to the state DNR and it was revamped for flood control of the upper lakes. The lake level today is a result of this newer dam. In 2007, the state reworked the dam to its present state. Basically, they reinforced it to prevent erosion and the other undermining of the flumes. The south flume was removed. There is no level control. Its purpose is to maintain the Lake James chain levels. If you look at the pond, you can still see the stumps of some of the trees used to build the original dam. Before the first dam, this would have looked similar to what the bottom of the dam looks like today. The schoolhouse, the present building is the third schoolhouse built at Nevada Mills. The original one was about 1/4 mile down Bachelor Road. It was a small wood frame building. The second schoolhouse was next to the present building and was a proper schoolhouse. Then in 1879, the present brick building was built using bricks from the brick factory that was on the north side of the mill pond. It was in use until 1945. The church to the left of the schoolhouse was established in 1872. Early services were held in the schoolhouses. Construction began in 1891 for the church and the building was dedicated in 1892. It was built on the site of one of the former blacksmith shops known as the Cooper Shop because barrel staves were made there. Of all the businesses and industries, the church is the only remaining active organization in Nevada Mills. The house on the southwest corner was from around 1850, although the deed shows 1945. Ernest Newt's home, then the Mungers. The house has been added to several times. The current owners renovated the house 2 years ago. The house on the other side of the dam was from around 1870. It was moved there by the Farvers in 1940. It's a gray house behind the arrow sign. It is the former Fred Terry's home. They were the owners of the Terry store that sat just north of the dam. There's an old turbine sitting on the corner of the lot. Up to the 1930s and 40s, before the state took over the dam, on a trip upstream on Crooked Creek from the mill pond to Jimerson Lake, one would pass only 2 or 3 small cottages. Today's trip will highlight features of that time as relayed by Lynn Munger in his book, The History of Nevada Mills. Today the creek is considered a channel that is part of Jimerson Lake. The trip is still a pleasant meandering ride past many open spaces. Much of the wetlands along the way on the shorelines are part of the Jimerson Lake Wetland Conservation Area. As we head down the stream, you'll see there's still lilies on both sides and lots of trees hanging over the lake. I understand there used to be a swing by the church and people would swing down, probably drop into the water. We're soon going to come to where there are houses on both sides, nice lake homes. People use the lake for swimming or the Crooked Creek for swimming and parking their boats. And I see we're coming upon some swans, a pair to the left. This is Terry's Cove, the inlet to the north. The land has been owned by Raymond Terry, who was Fred Terry's brother. At the north end, it is headed west encircling a high ground peninsula. It was where the brick factory was located. The cove was a popular spot for spearing bass. That's where the brick mill was, where they made the bricks. We're now coming to where the upper dam was across. This was built to hold back the water while the main dam was being built. Up to the 1940s, you could still see some of its posts. Mr. Munger claims if you know where to look, you can still find them. That's where the yellow ball goes across. It's a very nice afternoon for a leisurely trip up Crooked Creek. We're coming to the narrow part known as the Old Ford. That's knowledge handed down from Gene Roger, whose family farm was on the south side. Before the dam went in, it was a good place for horses and wagons to cross because it was flat on each side. We're coming to the lilies up there on the left. That was Higgins Cove. The inlet to the north was good for bluegill. We're not saying how the fishing is there today. It is surrounded by Remke's farm, now the Taylor farm, which at one time stretched all the way around to the main lake. Where the brown house is past the flag used to be Bennett's Shack, which is no longer standing. It was used by the locals for night fishing. They would spear, net, or even set a trout line for bullhead catfish, and then would go into the shack and wait. There are lots of turtles here now. The flats, the larger expanse of water and surrounding territory, is called the flats. Up to this point and further up and to around the lake, most of the shoreline has a significant slope. The mobile home park is sitting on relatively flat land in comparison. The water in the inlet was fairly shallow and flat, supposedly a good place for perch. On the northeast shore is the remains of an old cottage. Zerenke rented it out occasionally, and in early days he had visions of opening a restaurant there. It had a sign out front, Poplar Point. After his death, the cottage was allowed to remain in ruins. Today, all that is left is a chimney stack and some of the foundation barely visible through the foliage. And contrary to what many may claim, it was not burned down in an Indian raid. The trees over to the left was Paul Collins' property, which was part of a 350-acre farm owned by Ernie Nitz in the early 1900s. The story is Mr. Nitz tried to sell 100-foot lakefront lots for $50, but didn't get many, if any, takers at the time. We're coming up on Martin Lake. There was only one cottage there that sat on the east shore. A family from Chicago named Liskey. Martin Lake was the favored ice fishing spot for perch. The cottage that the man from Chicago owned was right here on the left somewhere. And it was a favorite ice fishing spot for perch. We're coming up on Webb Lake. There was a large channel that separated Martin from Webb Lake. Webb was a deeper lake and was famous for large pike. The high ground on the east side was owned by George Webb, hence the name of the lake. The property was sold to a Mr. Bicker who raised dogs. One could not pass without setting off a chorus of many dogs barking. That's where the dogs were, up on the left on the hill. As you can see, Webb Lake is a hot spot for all kinds of boating. We're in a Jimerson Lake now. This marks the boundary of the Jimerson Wetlands Conservation Area. This is also where Lynn Munger's description ends, other than to note that there was a sunken island in the middle of the lake towards the west end where the water was only waist deep. Today, Jimerson is still a fairly shallow lake with much of the areas along the shore only 5 to 6 feet deep and many stumps. These areas would have been marshland prior to the dam being built. There are deeper spots, most 20 to 35 feet deep, with deepest being close to the 60 feet. These areas most likely were glacier ponds prior to the dam. Up until the 1960s and early 1970s, there were no structures on the south and west shores between the Jimerson Shores Mobile Home Park and Schroeder's Mobile Homes on the far east, southeast shore. To the right is the sign, the Jimerson Wetland Conservation Area, Department of Natural Resources, Division of Fish and Wildlife. Right in here is where the island was. The 3 cottages and a store were right up there on the shoreline. The south cottage, which was built around 1925, the middle cottage around 1915, and the north cottage around 1920, and there's a store behind that was built around 1925. All 4 buildings were owned by the same family. The largest structure was the main cottage, and the 2 others were rentals. The large cottage was built as a replacement for an original cottage built around 1915 that burnt down soon after it was built. The store had a soda fountain and sold general goods and sundries. The store being there indicates that there were other cottages around in that area, but the only ones remaining are the one we will view on today's trip. None of these before buildings have been winterized. The store is used as a storage shed. The Myers Cottage, which is right up here, was built by the same builders who constructed the hotel next door. They ran a boat livery that rented boats to the hotel guests. The structure has been slightly modified and is winterized. Next to it, the Milliken Hotel, built around 1915 as a fisherman's hotel. It had 6 rooms and a tavern. It was a popular speakeasy during Prohibition. It was in business until the late 1940s when it was converted into a triplex that was used as full-time rentals up until the 1990s. Then the current owner converted it to a single-family cottage earlier this decade. There is a little island. This small patch of aquatic plants is the last remnants of an island that used to be several acres in size. Through the years, between the effects of wave action from boat traffic in the summer and the freezing of the lake in the winter, followed by sometimes fairly violent ice breakup in spring, have eroded the island to its final few yards. The Hanson Cottage, which was built around 1915, was the first cottage on the east shore. If any other cottages were around it in that area, they have either been drastically altered or are no longer standing. The structure has not changed much and has never been winterized. Over on your left, there's a boathouse, a gray cottage with a red roof, and there's a boathouse down by the lake. That's the Bruins Cottage, either the 4th or 5th cottage built on the north side. It appears the exterior has not been altered much, if at all, since it was built. The cottage was never winterized. Up on the right, there's a cobblestone cottage behind the flag. That is the Perry Cottage from around 1920. It was the second cottage built on the North Shore. The original owner bought the 2.5-acre plot to build a hunting camp with the current cottage as the main lodge. There were to be cabins built for rent. When the plan fell to the wayside, he sold half the property to his brother-in-law, as Mark Bold. The cottage's roof was raised and dormers added in the 1930s. It was winterized in 1969. Up on the hill, there's a gray cottage. This was the Bolt Cottage from around 1924. It was either the third or fourth cottage built on the North Shore. It was purchased from his brother-in-law, Edward Perry, the next cottage to the east. Originally, the cottage was built on 6 pilings with a root cellar in the northeast corner. Several years later, a basement was dug and closed in so a coal-burning furnace could be installed. The root cellar's originally hickory log center beam is still there. When the garage was built in the 30s, a room on the side was added that had a diesel-powered generator for electricity that was used until REMC brought power lines to this side of the lake. The cottage was renovated and winterized in 1989, with the only outdoor modification being the adding of a deck. Coming to the close cottage, which has the long steps going up that are concrete. It was built around 1915. It was the first cottage built on the North Shore. Joseph Close bought this entire portion of the lake shore from the channel to where Lane 340 is from Ernest Newts. The road originally was down closer by the lake instead of behind the cottages as it is today. He built the house himself except for the stonework, which he paid $300 to have done. When he passed away, he split the property between his 5 children, with only 2 of them building cottages around 1940. The last one by the channel and the red one. This ends our historical tour of Crooked Creek and Jimerson Lake, sponsored by the 101 Lakes Trust and Jimerson Lake Association. We thank you so much for viewing this and joining us in this trip. Thank you.